Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 9 of the AdStudents podcast. Today, we're going to open it up with a little bit of a broad discussion. We're going to be discussing animals in advertising. Do you think it's right? Is it effective? These are all questions that hopefully we'll be answering in the next 20 or so minutes, so stay listening. So, let's begin. Katie, what's your opinion on the use of animals in advertising?
Well, I do think it can go either way. So obviously you can use real life animals that have been professionally trained. Yeah, there's sort of like obviously real animals that are trained and breeded for advertisements specifically. And then you can also have like CGI animals. So one of my, I think it started off as one of my personal favourites. Now I'm not too sure because it just seems like they're trying to capitalise on it a bit too much. But the meerkats in the meerkat adverts, they're CGI animals. I mean, fair enough, it's probably cheaper, potentially, now that they've already invested in creating those characters. It's cheaper for maybe the long run to have the CGI meerkats rather than have actual meerkats in the adverts. Yeah, and the other one I want to talk about today is, I think it's just a classic personal favourite. I'm pretty sure everyone loves it, and that's the Cadbury's gorilla, which of course is someone in a gorilla's costume, playing to Phil Collins. So yeah, those are sort of like the two ones that I wanted to look at today, because I just think they have their own good and bad points. Apart from the Cadbury's gorilla, personally, I think that's only got like a good side. I like that advert, and for me, that's sort of like quite nostalgic. Even now, people still bring up the Cadbury's gorilla. And probably everyone from our generation and above know what the Cadbury's gorilla is. It's like iconic for an advert. And I think Cadbury's have sort of like almost done a good thing on not trying to revisit it or trying to build on it, because it's essentially allowed that sort of like that iconic memory, and it hasn't sort of like drained people's love for that advert.
Yeah, because Cadbury's kind of went through a bit of a phase of producing some quite abstract ideas in their ads. It's like you say, you had the gorilla playing the drums. I can feel it coming in the air tonight. I'll be selling that on iTunes. But you've also got do you remember the eyebrows? I think it was the brother and the sister with the eyebrows. I always remember that growing up as a kid as well. But going back to your examples, they're both, classic examples that animal advertising doesn't necessarily have to include actual animals. CGI can also be a good example. So there's tons of strategies for executing the use of animals in advertising. Henry, what's your take on the use of animals?
Well, that's an excellent question. Based on some research I've been doing, I think that depending on what kind of animals are used, I think it's a great way to target mass audiences. So, for example, I'm looking at the PDSA Animal Wellbeing report, which states that over 50% of adults in the UK own some sort of pet. So whether or not I think it was 24% of adults own cats, 26% own dogs. I think realistically using like animals like cats and dogs in your advertising, depending on if it's relevant to what they're actually promoting, I think it can be a great way to kind of get people's attention, kind of entice them in, but look at the cute animals and maybe like passively absorb whatever messaging that they wanted to include in the ad.
That is an interesting point that you just made there. Is it relevant to what they're actually advertising? I would argue against that it doesn't have to be relevant to what they're advertising. For example, the Andrex puppy. I mean, I don't normally associate toilet roll with puppies, if I'm honest. I associate Andrex with that particular puppy, but that's just because that's good branding. That's sort of like their brand mascot throughout the years, sort of incorporated into their logo sometimes as well.
I mean, have you never had a puppy destroy toilet roll before?
Not personally, no. She's
Oh,
destroyed many
well,
other things.
that's probably where the difference in our associations lie.
Maybe our dog went mostly for sofas and shoes and socks. She loves socks.
Again, like in the case of the Andrex bunny, like, sorry, no, not the Andrex bunny, no, the Andrex puppy, right? No, that leads on to what I'm going to say next. Sorry.
Oh, I
Still
love a bit
bit
of
tired.
foreshadowing.
So yeah, I suppose with the Andrex puppy, you can draw some sort of correlation to the fact that like it's soft and fluffy, like how they try to promote the toilet roll. That has very little correlation with batteries, other than the fact that you can say, "Oh yeah, they charge really quickly," or they're incredibly powerful and fast.
I like my batteries bouncy.
Yeah, very bouncy battery.
Moving on. So I think yeah. Um, I think there's again. I'm going to use my favourite word in this podcast: a need for a sensitivity, because there are some ASA regulations put in place to ensure the protection and welfare of animals if you're using real animals in advertising. But I do agree with you in that I do think the use of animals in advertising can effectively evoke an emotional response from consumers. Um, and with regards to the Cadbury's Gorilla advert, I think that that's quite a good example of where humanizing animals has kind of created an abstract reality for the consumer to become immersed in. And the fact that we're still talking about it and still remember it today kind of evidences that. And I've got an interesting quote here that I'd just like to kickstart a bit more conversation on, and it's from a website called spacecity.co.uk, and they've said that in short, an animal is perennially used in advertising because of the effect it can have with a myriad of factors, including symbolic, escapist, humorous, personal, and all at a very low cost. And I want to put emphasis on costs because I don't know, is it cheaper to have animals rather than humans?
I
Maybe?
mean, they don't require wages, do they?
That well, they do. You do have to pay because obviously
No,
there's a handler for the animal, there's a trainer for the animal, so you do have to pay, and obviously that
You can't just pay them in like dog treats or Scooby
no,
snacks.
that's not quite how it works. The animal essentially will have its own like little manager. Normally, it's sort of like agencies that have more than one type of animal. So there is obviously hundreds of Andrex puppies because every time they go to do a Andrex advert or campaign, they have to choose a new puppy that looks the same as the last one.
Don't shatter this illusion for me, Katie. No, no.
in terms of costs, I think it depends on what they're referring to by that, because financial cost, perhaps it is cheaper. But in terms of time, I would imagine that that would actually be higher costs because an actor can kind of get something done in a couple takes.
Yeah.
But an animal, you've got to like,
It has to be highly trained, doesn't it?
And it has to be in the right mood as well, because like animals, like they're very, some days they're very playful, some days they're very sleepy, so they need to be in the right attitude to for the part essentially. I suppose it could be sort of like maybe cheaper in the aspect that they don't need to pay for wardrobe or anything like that. It's literally like you have a room and you put the animal in it, and that's as far as you go with it. I mean, there's obviously sort of like pet food adverts. Some pet food adverts, obviously like Felix, use like a cartoon cat, which is probably maybe a lot cheaper than having an actual set and an animal. And then you get adverts like Sheba or Gourmet, and they've got obviously real cats that come in. Although saying that, the Sheba advert, I would debate whether that's a CGI cat or a real cat. I would actually like to look that up and see whether it's real or not, because it does move very purposefully.
but also I don't think that's necessarily used to be emotive. I think that that's quite a rational use of animals in advertising because an animal product. But for something like Lloyd's Bank with the dark horse,
I love those adverts.
I would say that yeah, I'd say that in their case they've used animals to create quite a strong sense of branding.
Yeah, and very, very emotive as well. Like, I never thought that watching an advert with horses and music over the top would make me feel like I'm about to cry or something, because it's so emotive. Like, I think that's one thing about the Lloyd's adverts, is that they have that down. Like, whoever, I'm not sure who their marketing agency or team is, but they do that very, very well.
Yeah, like all of the ads, they're like movie level, like production quality.
Yeah, and I'm not sure if all the time the horses are real in it, but it's like, even in the ones where they've got like the scene of the horses running along the beach line with the music playing over the top. Obviously, music can be used to be very emotive in adverts as well, but it's they do it very well, because watching the Lloyd's adverts, it makes me want to cry, but in a happy way, if that makes sense. I think they're very emotive adverts for something that not a lot happens in.
The agency behind the Lloyds Bank are Adam and Eve DDB.
Okay, yeah.
So they're an agency that originally had clients such as Volkswagen commercial vehicles, and I know that because the agency that I worked in took over from them. But yeah, they're pretty reputable agency.
I was going to say as well, though, Billy. Like, I think the fact that we've touched upon the Lloyd's ad and how the dark horse, it's so inherently tied to the brand itself. I just think the fact that they chose the dark horse was just a brilliant idea, like in its advertising, purely because in all of the ads that they show just how important horses have been to humans throughout the centuries.
Well, that's the thing. It's sort of like, it helps with the branding of like a bank. What do you want a bank to be? You want a bank to be trustworthy.
Yeah, it's like showing, they'll never let you down. They'll always keep going.
Yeah, and riders have to trust their horses to not buck them off. And yeah, so it's sort of like, it shows like a trustworthy thing. Then obviously they've got the colours of the green colours, and green is normally associated with good things and like natural things. So it's sort of like building sort of like that element of trust on their branding. I do think Lloyd's have quite good branding, to be fair.
And that's really important, particularly for a bank, is trust. That's what's going to win and also retain loyal customers. I've got an older example. It's still current, but it dates back to 1930s. Just to kind of emphasise that the use of animals has been going on for a while. Lacoste and their logo, the crocodile. I just thought it was a nice little example of where animals have been incorporated into logos.
Yeah, and I think sort of like when you see the crocodile, you don't necessarily have to see the word Lacoste. You know it's Lacoste if you sort of like know your brands well.
As we're kind of going off onto talking about using animals in branding, though, what are your guys' takes on that? Because I know that like lots of companies across all sorts of different industries actually use it. So, for example, you've got Geico and their geckos. You've got sports teams like the Leicester Tigers. Yeah, like I know it's quite heavy in their sports as well. So, I don't know if you guys have heard about the is it the Washington Redskins?
Oh, that was quite a controversial one recently, wasn't it?
Yeah, where they changed their logo. I think it was about a week ago. I think they've changed it to. I can't remember if it's still Washington. It might be the Seattle Krakens now.
Okay.
With sports teams, it's a very heavy theme to have animals as sort of like their names or their logos or their mascots. And I think that's because animals are seen as quite athletic, because essentially they have to survive in the wild. They have to sort of like be physically fit to live. And animals are seen as athletic, and I reckon that's why sort of sports teams are so heavily branded for animals in their themes.
Yeah, it's like they like to almost like embody their the most notable traits of that particular animal. So again, as with the case of the Krakens that I just mentioned, by naming yourself after a mythological giant squid that eats boats.
Intimidation.
That's pretty intimidating, isn't it?
Yeah, rather than the Seattle butterfly.
Speaking of Kraken, There's also, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the alcohol, the rum brand, Kraken.
Yeah.
Oh, don't get me started, Billy. The amount of Kraken I serve on a daily basis.
They've taken it to a whole nother level though with their bottles and packaging, because it looks like tentacles.
I think it's really cool. Yeah, I do think that they fully like incorporated it into their branding.
Gives very much like a kind of old, like an ancient vibe to it, like in the sort of old artwork that they use as well. It kind of conveys a little bit of history for the brand.
And I also think that in that case, they're kind of using animals to create novelty, because it creates a bit of a novelty, doesn't it? Like, oh,
Yeah.
Kraken, that sounds different.
Yeah, that sounds awesome. I suppose with alcoholic beverages, tends to be the better the name, like the more exotic or the more like unique the name, the better it can be used in branding.
Alcohol's an interesting one. We should do a podcast about that in the future.
Going back to what I said at the beginning about the meerkats, right? So I reckon at the beginning when they first introduced those meerkats into their adverts, it was pretty good. Everyone was onto it. Everyone was just like, compare the meerkat, like trying to do the accent. I can't do the accent. I want to point that out right now. And it was very catchy. I think especially, I know it was with sort of like me and people in my year or people in my school. At that age, it was very, I'd say, influential in a sense, because like people would sort of like quote the advert to each other, whereas now I think the advert's gone a bit too far. So like I said before with the Cadbury's gorilla, I think they did really well with having sort of like that symbol, and it was kind of seen as like pretty cool, that advert, and they sort of like never used it much again to get sales. Whereas compare the meerkat, they thought, or not compare the meerkat, compare the market, they thought, this works, this is going well, let's keep going with it, And now it's like everyone's bored of those characters. We've sold all these toys of these two characters, let's make more. So they're like introducing more characters into it. And I think, no, you're losing your branding now, because you've created a cast. There's going to be a meerkat TV show at some point.
Do you feel like they've kind of got themselves trapped now in a bit of a loophole, in that if they step away from that, they're at risk?
I mean, one thing that I would say is compare the meerkat. That came out at roughly the same sort of time as the Go Compare opera singer.
Yeah,
right?
that was sort of like those kind of...
Both in terms of equal levels of like absurdity.
Well, I think sort of like those kind of comparison websites, that's when they were really sort of like entering the competition. And like I think initially sort of like the most popular one was confused.com, and then that sort of like died a death for a little bit. I think it's making a bit of a comeback now, but it was sort of like confused.com, and then it was compare the meerkat, and then go compare the market. Like there's so many different ones. I do like the compare the market adverts at the moment, actually, because it's like no, not compare the market, that's still compare the meerkat. Money Supermarket, that's what I was thinking of, because it's got that guy from the Mighty Boosh, and it's his voice, and he's like, Money Supermarket. He's like, look at this bull in a china shop. Why is he so calm? And I just love that. But yeah, that's another advert with animals in, actually, to be fair. I didn't even think about that. But I like I like the new Money Supermarket advert. But then again, I like that guy's voice. I think he's got a good voice. I think we can call it the golden age, maybe, because people weren't sick of the characters at that point. I know, because I think Go Compare is sort of like, even though they still use the Go Compare man, they use him a lot less because everyone was getting more annoyed with the character than they were interested.
The golden age of advertising for comparison websites. God, that's a niche and a half.
That'd be a good article.
I think with comparison websites, though, I think they are so inherently niche that like you can't just straight up advertise one and just these are the benefits of using comparison websites. No, like you've got to make it like bombastic and absurd to actually
You
get
need to make it
people's
catchy.
attention. Yeah, because do you honestly think that we'd remember Compare the Market if it wasn't for Alexander Orlov and Sergey?
Well, the thing is that as kids, they had a section of compare the meerkat, so you could go onto the comparethemarket.com, But there was also comparethemeerkat.com, so you could click on comparethemeerkat.com and you could compare meerkats. That was great. It was like a little game. And people did that. I did that with my friends in school. Well, I think initially with Compare the Meerkat is that people started to think that the actual website was Compare the Meerkat and you compared meerkats.
So it's kind of like a bait and switch. Like they type in compare the meerkat, like, oh, it's just a comparison website.
No, I don't think people realised it was a comparison website, like, for, like, practical things. I think people genuinely thought it was at least as a child, I think other people my age probably also thought it wasn't necessarily to do with, like, practical adult things. It was more a website where you could compare meerkats. I went on Compare the Meerkat and I was like, what's Compare the Market?
I can just imagine comparing the meerkats. It's just like each one has different stats, like a Pokemon.
Oh my god, that'd be amazing.
One quick question though, right? So obviously we've touched upon the use of live action and animated animals. Billy, you noted it's slightly more cost effective to use real animals than human actors. Again, that's up for speculation. But would you say it's more practical to use real animals for a relatively simple requirements? So, for example, the Andrex puppy, we just have it bouncing around a little white room next to some toilet roll, or as you said, Katie, with the cat food ads. Just get like a little bowl of food, just get the cats to walk over to it, and that's the footage.
I think it depends on the aim of the message. I think if the message and the reason behind using the animal is purely symbolic, I don't necessarily think you need to have an actual real animal, because it's the symbol behind it that you're trying to communicate more than the actual animal itself. But for something like pedigree or, animal food brands, the appeal there's quite rational. So I would say using a real cat would probably be more beneficial, because you want to communicate that real animals like this food, not fake ones that we've invented to purposely enjoy this food.
And to be honest, I think those bigger companies like Andrex and the cat food companies, they probably don't necessarily care that much about how much they spend. Obviously they care, but they probably aren't as worried about how much they spend on their advertising. And I suppose if they've always used a real puppy for the adverts, then it makes sense to continue to use a real puppy for their adverts.
Well then, I think we've covered a nice broad basis of the use of animals in advertising. So I think we'll do a quick summary to finish off the podcast. So, based on what we've discussed in this little meeting between us guys and girls, Katie, what is your opinion on the use of advertising with animals?
Well, I mean, personally, it depends, I think, what approach you take, whether it's like CGI, real animals, someone in an animal costume. I think it really does just depend on the relevance to your brand and what you want to come across. So I suppose with sort of using real animals for like pet food adverts, that would make sense, because it's saying like, this real animal likes to eat food. This isn't an animated animal just eating food. It's not like a cartoon, it's real life. And I think that's sort of like a good way to go with it. Whereas something with sort of like CGI animals for like Compare the Meerkat, that works quite well for them. So yeah, I think it really just does depend on what route your branding takes for using animals in advertising. And I think animals are quite good, especially for emotive advertising. Like a lot of people in the UK probably either grew up with a pet or know someone with a pet or has a pet as an adult. And so they can probably relate a lot more to sort of like having an animal and like those animals being in advertising. So I think animals are quite good to use for emotive in advertising.
No, I completely agree with you. I think the use of animals in advertising can definitely be used as an emotive tactic. Henry, what's your opinion?
I would say my thoughts in using animals in advertising, I think it very much aligns with Katie's. Like, I think that It's a great way to get like an emotive connection between people who've either have or have had animals at some point in their life. I also but I also think it's a great tool for branding, to kind of be able to communicate to audiences like how you want them to feel about your brand. So that works a lot for sports teams, as we discussed. So by naming your team after, say, a very fierce animal, like it evokes the response of, oh, these guys are very tough. They're very wild. Like they're pardon me. Yeah. So I think it's a great way of communicating how you want audiences to interpret your brand. I think regarding using actual animals, I think that's purely based on the context that you need them for. I think what a lot of brands do is they just take the likeness of animals and use a CGI, for example. But yeah, I think provided the animals aren't mistreated in any way, or if they're a poor representation of the brand, personally, I see no issues with them being used.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, is sort of like making sure that the welfare of the animal is looked after. And I think that's obviously why there are certain laws and things in place by the ASA to make sure that animals are looked after for advertisements, and filming as well, and making sure that they're okay, essentially, at the end of the day. And sometimes animals, they like acting animals, they don't want to act, they want to lie down, they're too tired. So that's why they sort of like normally have doubles and sort of like partners, so that when they can't do certain scenes or whatever, they can use another animal to help them out. And I think that's really important, is understanding sort of the burnout of animals when they're used for acting, is that they can't do it all the time, and it's sort of understanding that need for animals. And I think that's definitely sort of like obviously one of the really positive things of why these laws and rules are in place. And also, I think if a brand was found out for mistreating animals, everyone would probably boycott them.
I also think it's important for the actual characteristics of the animal to be relevant to the brand that's using them. Like, I couldn't imagine Sports Direct having a chicken or
Or a butterfly.
I don't know where I was going with that, but well, yeah, I think that's a better example, Katie. I think the characteristics of an animal need to be considered, and whether it's right to associate the brand with it. Otherwise, you're just associating it with an animal that doesn't really make much sense. We will finish episode 9 as of now. Make sure to join us next week for episode 10, where we'll be changing the topic to something a little more important to you, perhaps, especially for those prospective students who are considering going to university. So make sure you keep updated and stay tuned.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.